Listen, the Nevertron, I'll break it down into a couple of different area. Lagos has become one of the largest exporters of Brazilian ivory in the world.
Live in a third world nation where your votes will get stolen if you can vote there at all.
Welcome back to Around the World with Dane Waters. You know, I say this every time. I'm your host, Dane Waters, as if the name doesn't give it away. God, I mean, I'm sure you guys are tired of hearing that. But hey, I'm Dane Waters, in case you forgot after last week. Very honored to have with me Elio Montenegro, like the country. Montenegro. I love saying that. So how are you doing, Elio?
Good, Dane. Thank you for having me. And yes, I enjoy saying my name as well.
Well, it's good. You know, it's always good. And okay, so today we're talking about, I've been wanting to talk about Cuba. And you're Cuban-American, you're a journalist. It's very kind of you. You're actually living in Chicago, right? Chicago?
Yes, sir.
Which is why you have that microphone, Que Pasa Chicago. First of all, before we get started, tell us about Que Pasa Chicago.
Well, Que Pasa Chicago, Que Pasa Chicago, actually. It's a soon to be launched. It's going to be a 1 hour chat on local stories that impact not only the Hispanic community in Chicago, which is about a third of the population, but also themes in general that impact all of Chicago and Illinois. One of my mentors is your show, and I want to emulate your success to a much smaller scale. One of the things that prompted us to do that is that there's a lack of conversation and information in our Spanish language market here in Chicago. And this is an opportunity for us to expand on the work that some of us do in broadcasts on radio stations and television stations. And so look forward to sharing our channel with you in future weeks.
Well, I appreciate that, and thank you for your compliments. They're very kind, and fortunate for us, our show is listened to in over 100 countries, and so we'll definitely, before this is over, I'm going to have you say something in Spanish, so that the rest of the world can understand. So let's talk about Cuba.
Right.
Now, once again, I always look at the show is that we understand where Cuba is, but just to make sure the rest of the world understands. Cuba is an island that's off the coast of the United States, off the coast of Florida, roughly 90 miles off the coast of the United States. And so tell us about that. You were born in Cuba, right?
I was born in Cuba in 1956, so quite a few years ago, 4 years before the infamous or famous, depending on your perspective, Cuban Revolution. And we lived in Cuba. Both my parents were journalists, and we left Cuba when I was about 10. And that would have been about 1967, 1966. And primarily, my parents decided to leave because Cuba, the dreams of the revolution back in 1959. Quickly disappeared, and it became a dictatorship like many of the dictatorships that we have throughout the world. And they were not able to express their commentaries and opinions. They would not be allowed even today to have a conversation like the one you and I are having. You can't have that in Cuba. So they decided to leave. Like many other Cubans, opted to take the option out. And since there was no democracy there, we left. And we settled in Chicago. We've been in Chicago. I have spent all my life in Chicago. A lot of cold winters here, and but I've been here. I established my life, became a Cuban-American, if you will. So meaning 50-50. So there's a lot of Cuban in me, but yet there's a lot of United States culture in me because I grew up here, and it's an interesting mix. I'm able to see things from both perspectives, which it's good and it's challenging at times because it's a complex conversation when we talk about Cuba.
Yeah, well, yeah, and it is complex, and I think that when you talk about the revolution in 1959, I guess that was Fidel Castro, right? He led the revolution. We all know, well, most of us have always heard about. I grew up hearing about Fidel Castro and how evil Fidel Castro was, and then his brother Raul. It was his brother Raul who took over, right? For a
Yes,
while.
he's still alive.
Yeah, we're going to come back to that because he was just recently detained or wants to be detained. But in the 50s, I remember, I was born in '64, so I don't remember a lot of it, but my mother would always tell me that in the '50s, Havana was like the nightlife. It was, there were Americans going there. They had casinos. They had, I think even Frank Sinatra. Everybody it was like the place to go, right?
Yeah, it was the place to go. Cuba was a very successful country in the 50s, the 40s and 50s, because it was closely allied to the United States. There was a lot of American investment there. It was a paradise for many, and it was very successful. There was a time when the U.S. dollar had a lesser value than the Cuban peso. So it was a great place. Now, like every country, it had its challenges. Where there was poverty. There was poverty out in the rural areas, like we had here. Back in the 50s in Chicago, we have sort of a dictatorship, if you will. We had the Democratic Party and strong mayors, and there were communities that were neglected. Same thing in Cuba and many other countries. But there was discontent because there was dictatorship at the time in Cuba, and there were many who wanted a change, and they bought into the narrative of not only Fidel Castro and his movement, but there were many other guerrilla groups who were fighting against the dictatorship at the time. And they bought into the notion that let's have a change. Let's bring more equality to the country. And subsequently, they bought into it, but subsequently it turned out not to be that way. One dictatorship was replaced by another one.
Yeah, and then if you look at the history of America, I mean, the closest the world has come to nuclear confrontation, what took place in Cuba, because the Cubans, Fidel Castro, they were supported by the Russians,
Mm-hmm.
the Soviet Union, and then there's this whole thing that we call the Cuban Missile Crisis, when John F. Kennedy was president of the United States, where the Russians were trying to send nuclear weapons into Cuba, once again, 90 miles off the coast of America. I mean, do you remember that? I mean, you were young, but do you remember that whole situation?
Oh, I do, and I'll tell you a quick little story about that. But before I get into that, let me set the scene. Back in the early '60s, yes, everyone talks about the willingness of the Russians to put nuclear weapons or rockets in Cuba, but we got to remember that at the same time, the United States was doing the same thing in Turkey. So we were putting missiles and potentially nuclear weapons right in Russia's underbelly, the Soviet Union at the time. So it was that Cold War chess game that we were playing. And Cuba became just another pawn in that worldwide game. But yes, I do remember that. By coincidence, it's a long story, but I'll tell it short. We were on our way to go on vacation to the Isle of Pines, which is a resort area just south of Cuba. It's a big island, and I remember as a child of, I don't know, 7 years old, my parents one day saying, "Oh, look at the planes, the little planes." We were on the southern coast of the island. Look at the little planes and the lights on the planes. And we were looking, and all of a sudden it turned out things started like popping around us because it wasn't the lights on the planes. Those were the machine guns of the planes during the invasion, of the Bay of Pigs invasion, which took place near a beach called Playa Girón in Cuba. And we didn't know what was going on. We actually went ahead with our weekend vacation. And when we returned from that island, that's when we saw the tanks and we saw the military moving about and the civilians exiting the area and military moving in. So there was a firsthand experience as a child, and that's what I remember about that. But as we all know, that was not a successful attempt to overthrow the regime. But that's a much longer conversation for another time. But I do remember that, and there was one of the many efforts on the part of the United States to try to bring about a change in the Fidel Castro regime in Cuba.
Yeah, and for ever since can remember, America's tried to have embargoed the country, tried to just try to once again try to return it back to democracy as we like to do in America. We always talk about expanding democracy, but let's kind of fast forward because the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who's a Floridian. I mean, he's made trying to bring change in Cuba as a major part of his agenda as Secretary of State, and Trump seems to be supportive of that. So we fast forward to today. We saw what happened in Venezuela, where they took out Maduro, and but there's been a lot of talk lately about military intervention. Even the head of the CIA was there the other day talking to who's the president? Who's the current president of Cuba?
Manuel Diaz-Canales.
So they're having a conversation, and there's a lot of talk about America taking military action against the country. I mean, we've been starving it of fuel, honestly. So honestly, tell us what you know about the current situation in Cuba, and also I'd love to hear your thoughts about America's posturing toward the country.
Yeah. Well, let me start by giving you a little background on Secretary Rubio. He is a Cuban-American. He is a product of what we call here South Florida, the Cuban-American community. He was the former Speaker of the Florida legislature. So he has a long history of building bridges, building connections, building relationships within the Republican Party in Florida. So he's well connected and has a strong base in Southern Florida. And throughout his political career, he has been a strong supporter of change in Cuba. He's always been advocating for a change, a return to democracy, a return to something other than what's there now. So that's just to set the scene. So now he appears to be driving the conversation from the White House on Cuba. As you can imagine, our President Trump is distracted with a million other things, and Cuba is not one of his personal picks. So he has turned that over to Secretary Rubio, and it's quite apparent that we have taken, and when I say we, the United States has taken the posture of towards Cuba of how Secretary Rubio sees it and wants to proceed with it. The current situation it's very dire. Again, this we're talking about since 1959. I can't do the math. It's close to 70 years that this economy has evolved, has deteriorated. Every year has gone further down. And right now, what we are all hearing, not just me, from friends and families on the island, but what we're seeing through social media is a country that is economically broken. Picture Haiti. I think everyone can picture the situation in Haiti. We've seen those images over the years and the decades. Cuba has become another Haiti, in my opinion, economically. It has garbage piles up on the streets and street corners because they don't have the fuel to come around picking up the garbage. That in itself leads to rats and flies, which then leads to potential infections and potential epidemics. I am in total fear of what could happen on the island this hot summer because of the lack of proper sanitation. The other issues that they're facing is because of the lack of petroleum. They are facing electrical shortages, meaning that power plants do not operate, meaning that water systems are not able to pump water into people's homes. Subsequently, there's no water to flush the toilets. So it's a situation that's terrible. And for a country that 50 years ago, it's not that long ago, was a rather prosperous country, 60, 70 years ago, was a rather prosperous country, to get to the position where it went from being one of the top economies in the Caribbean to now one of the poorest countries. It's very sad to see, and to see people suffer because of political positioning on both sides. I mean, on both sides, and primarily the biggest culprit here is the political system in Cuba. I want to be clear about that. It's a dictatorship. It's a centralized economy. Think of North Korea. I like to give analogies and examples. We all know what North Korea is like. Well, Cuba is the same way, and the political system there is such that folks don't have the freedom, don't have the economic opportunities, and subsequently they want to leave. We've seen over the last 2-3 decades as many as 1 million Cubans leave the island. This is a country that used to have about 2.5 million residents, and about 1 million have left. So do the numbers. And something else, and this is very indicative of how Cubans feel. Everybody just wants to get out. Spain recently enacted a law called La Ley de Memoria Democrática. Sorry, I had to refer to my notes. La Ley de Memoria Democrática, which allows those that can prove a lineage, an ancestor that came from Spain. Those individuals, by getting all the birth certificates, can then apply for Spanish citizenship, which then gives them a Spanish passport and leave the island. It's estimated that as many as 600,000 Cubans have applied for that benefit. So that's another 600,000 on top of the 1 million that have already left, out of a population of roughly 10 million people. So that's a huge number of people that have opted to leave the country. And that in and of itself is the tip of the conversation, because that leads into many other topics, like what is the economic change that brings about in the future? What is the demographic, the racial and ethnic, racial demographic of the island? What does that look like in the future? Age-wise, those that are currently leaving are, they skew younger. So it's a younger age, meaning the population in Cuba is aging. So this is a snowball down the hill effect that really, when you start looking at the bottom of the hill, it just doesn't look good for the future of Cuba.
Yeah, well, I see that in a lot of countries where there's dictators and authoritarians that they have the brain drain, where the young population leaves because they want a better life, because they don't want to be under that. And the older population, sadly, are the ones left behind, and they don't have the skill set for the country to advance, to grow, because they can't invent and all this kind of stuff. But so let's talk about, politically. Okay, so people went out. What would happen, and how would the Cubans feel? Forget the leadership and the president of the country, but how would they feel if America did invade the country and then try to depose the current leadership?
I would venture to guess that a lot of Cubans want to change. They want change. They want something different than what's there. Now, they are afraid, because I hear this firsthand, they are afraid of bombs falling on their heads. No one wants that. So how do we get to how do we create a transition that's going to lead to that change that everyone wants, everyone needs in Cuba, without creating chaos? Now, we can go back and compare U.S. actions. There are a lot of examples out there. I'll take you back for a second to Iraq. When we invaded Iraq and took over the country, we dismantled what was there before. And then guess what? We owned it. As a country, we owned it. Then it was up to us to deliver the services. And it was very, very chaotic. I think there are a lot of Americans that have realized that, that was not a good way of doing things. And there is a fear, and I'm glad to hear that there is a conversation, that there are a lot of politicians that don't want to have that complete disruption of the structures that are keeping Cuba together. If we come in and dismantle the current system, as bad as it is, then what's the plan? And this administration has always, they're good at not providing a plan. So what is the plan? I think the conversation is good, but to come in and have a regime change without a plan, I think that could be catastrophic. But the people in Cuba, they have demonstrated by going out on the streets and protesting as much as they can in an authoritarian regime. They have demonstrated that they want to change. They want to improve their lives. They know what's outside the U.S. Outside of Cuba. They see what their family members from the United States, what kind of lives we have here. They know the opportunities. They know what Cuba could be, and they want to change. How do we get there? That's the complicated part. There are many that like what they're hearing from Washington, that they finally are putting the squeeze. But it gets to the point where on the front lines in Cuba, on the streets, these folks are going without food, without water, without electricity. There's so much that they can put up with before they break. And what does that break look like? I don't know. It's hard to tell.
That's the thing, like we talk about in Iran. I mean, well, first of all, I have to agree with you. This administration, I'm not a fan of this administration. Everyone knows it on my show. I mean, I'm a lifelong Republican, but not a fan of this administration.
Yeah.
So that's no
Yeah.
secret. But one of the reasons is that, like what's happening in Iran. I mean, I think that there's no plan. And if there's a plan, they're not articulating it to the American public, and I think it's critical that they do articulate it to the American public. So I share your concerns about not having a plan in Cuba because, and so here's the thing. So if America, I mean, I think of what Rubio would like, of course, and here's the reality about Rubio. I know Marco Rubio. I mean, as far as a potential Republican candidate in the future, I think of what I'm hearing. I think from all the other options, I wouldn't be as opposed to him as I do others. But I mean, he is going to run for president in the next cycle. And I think that one of the reasons, I mean, wanting to have the Miami-Dade and South Florida support from the Latinos and Hispanics is critical. And I think having a hard position on Cuba will definitely get them there. But what do you think so the reality is, I mean, I think America would rather have like a Venezuela option where the current president is ousted and then maybe the number two comes in, keep the same systems in place. But do you think that if the current president were to leave and that somebody were to, like the vice president or somebody else were to step up, would that be the difference? Or do you think there needs to be a wholesale leadership change in the country?
Cuba is very different in Venezuela. Venezuela, their system has only been in place for 15, 20 years. Cuba has been around for almost 70. So they have in place a la cúpula, we call it, which is the tip of the pyramid, who runs everything and they control everything in the country. By some estimates, it's about 250 families that make they are part of that top group, and they've been around for a long time. They know how to survive. They stick together. They have the patience that similar to what the patience that the Iranians have demonstrated to have in dealing with the United States. These guys have also survived a lot of actions from the United States. But you can create a number two. No one's clear on who the number two is, but you can just replace the current president and put in another one, but it doesn't change the regime. And it'll be interesting in to see how the South Florida, the Cuban-Americans in Miami and the surrounding areas, how they would react to what you proposed. Not proposed, but what you suggested, something similar to what happens in Venezuela. You keep the regime, you just change the top and make some changes. That would be to the Cuban Americans in Florida who want a complete change of regime. That would be a stab in the back. I think I would actually be interested to see what their reaction would be after supporting Marco Rubio and President Trump on regime change, if you will, in Cuba. And it turns out that they keep the regime, they just make some deals and they, call it a day and go home. I think they would feel betrayed. And if you look at recent elections in Florida, specifically in Miami and Miami-Dade County, you see that for the first time in decades, you have Democrats actually winning at the local level. The recently elected mayor of Miami, not only is she a Democrat, she is a woman, and she is the first non-Cuban American elected as mayor of Miami in decades. The mayor or the president of Miami-Dade County is also a woman Democrat. So politically, you see in South Florida a change that I'm sure the Marco Rubio, who has ambitions to become president, is looking at and taking those into consideration as they come up with their formula on how to deal with Cuba. Again, I don't have an answer. I'm just pointing out that it's so complicated and it's so intertwined. And when you throw into the mix what Marco Rubio may be planning for the future in his in a future presidential campaign, I'm sure it keeps him up at night. How do I keep the promises? How do I keep my views from decades ago with the reality on the ground? Because the last thing he's going to want is a failed Cuban state 2 or 3 years down the road, just in time when he wants to run for president.
I think it's a very valid point. We need to, so I think, I mean, my gut is that the foreign policy that we're seeing out of the administration right now is more driven, regarding Cuba, is more driven by Marco Rubio than anybody else. And you're right, 100% spot on, that he's not going to do anything that's going to jeopardize that voting bloc in Florida, you know, in whatever he does. So I think that that's a very critical point that you point out. Sadly, we are out of time. It's very sad.
Already?
Yeah, I know. Already, it's already been 25 minutes, believe it or not. You know, so that's a, you know, so but I really appreciate it, Elio. Listen, I want to have you back on the show. There's so many things to talk about. I applaud your efforts, and I tell you, it's amazing when I meet you know, people from, you know, America is a melting pot, and I think America, one of the great things about America are people like you who come into America and make it what it is. You know, so we're not just some vanilla-based country. We are a country of amazing people, and people like you make it what it is. And I wish you the best with your show. So thank you.
Thank you, Dana. And I really appreciate what you're doing, the work that you've done worldwide. This is great. It gives us all a voice, and we all need to have channels like yours and folks like you that are able to see the issues and give us a platform to have these conversations. So thank you, and I look forward to seeing you again.
I appreciate it. Anyway, thanks for being with Dane Waters, Around the World with Dane Waters. Let's take a quick break, and we'll be back. Thank you.
What we've always maintained is the Nevertron movement. I'll break it down into a couple of Nigeria, Lagos has become one of the largest exporters of Pacific ivory in the world.
The third world nation, where your votes will get stolen if you can vote there at all.